The United Nations commemorates the International Day of Multilateralism and Diplomacy on the 24th of April every year. The day seeks to disseminate the advantages of multilateralism and diplomacy for peace, including through educational and public awareness. We are therefore proud as the City of Kings and Queens that the media brief is being held in our city through our media platforms during the special occasion known as the ZITF, which brings the country together. Without much further ado, I would like to invite the Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Information, Publicity and Broadcasting Services, Mr. Lipangwana, to give his welcome remarks.
I've been asked to make some opening remarks, basically welcome remarks. So let me start by saying, you are all welcome. Under different circumstances, probably my job would be done because I welcomed you and I think everybody is now feeling at home. But then let's talk a little bit more about why we are here today. The United Nations uses international days as a way of, as an advocate tool, a very powerful advocate tool. So from the media sector, which is a sector we all come from, we have the International Radio Day, we have the International Press Freedom Day, which I think is happening next week, correct? And now, and many other days are there. But recently, as recent as 2018, the end of, that is December, the United Nations set up another day through a General Assembly resolution. And that day is what we are gathered here for, which is, of course, the International Day for Multilateralism and Diplomacy. Now, it's a very young day on the UN calendar. We have gathered to brief the media, which they are mainly going to do. I'm yet welcome. But to brief the media, number one, to mobilize political will, to mobilize resources even, because of yes, human resources are resources, intellectual resources are resources, to build critical mass, as well as to celebrate and commemorate the achievements of humanity over many challenges that the world faces. And we would like to reinforce the need to resolve conflicts through peaceful resolutions and through peaceful means. So the idea is that countries should always seek solutions through peaceful means such as diplomacy, negotiations, arbitration, and so on. I think that's very key considering what's happening internationally right now and what's happening in the world, which is that we have the world facing one of the biggest challenges it's facing since the Second World War. I would say since 1945, which obviously the Second World War culminated into the formation of the United Nations, who are the people that gathered us here today. And I believe one of the reasons why we're facing what we're facing as a world is because of unilateralism and the hegemony. But this is a day about multilateralism. So maybe it would help for me to start by discussing what do we mean by multilateralism. It basically means that this is cooperation between, at the very least, 3 states. And of course, without patronizing members of the media, unilateralism is basically one country. Bilateralism, it's you and I, 2 people, or 2 countries. So in this particular case, we are saying we are celebrating or commemorating multilateralism, of which if we come to our regional, sub-regional, or at the international stage, we would say the United Nations is a multilateral institution. SADC is a multilateral institution, though it's sub-regional. And of course, the AU, the African Union, is another multilateral institution, but it's a regional institution in that regard. Of course, its counterparts will be the EU and so on and so forth. So that's what we mean by multilateralism. So the events happening in Russia and Ukraine indicate that the multilateral approach should be promoted. So this is where the media comes in. And I think this is why Edward Cullen and his team found it very important that we should engage the media in this way, because the media drives public support, promotes public support, and pushes the public support in terms of the agenda that we want, which is that promotion of multilateralism. Why is this important to Zimbabwe? Why do we think this is pertinent? Well, let me say, I don't know if they would like me to say this, but I'm going to say it anyway, me being me. In 2008, July, there was an attempt at multilateral consensus in imposing sanctions against Zimbabwe. So the multilateral system, which is the UN system that was there through the Security Council, did not yield the outcome that was expected. Which outcome was that everybody would have agreed that this country deserves to be under sanctions. So Russia and China, using the system that was in place, exercised their veto rights. And so the multilateral system did not achieve what was meant to be achieved in this regard. What happened next? A unilateral system was put in place, which is where we say it has a lot of fault lines, and sanctions were unilaterally imposed against Zimbabwe when the multilateral system had failed. And that's wrong. Because if we want to promote global peace, if we want to live in a world which we desire, a world that faces and confronts humanitarian challenges and other human challenges and global challenges, then let's use the system that's in place, and which is a multilateral system. At the moment, as we promote that multilateral system and we continue and we hope that the media will work with us in promoting this multilateral system, we also know that some of the facets of it don't really work as they should. Because in that multi-layered multilateral system, we have institutions like IMF, the World Bank, and so on. Are they acting or working fair? Do they promote justice even among nations? Is Zimbabwe treated fairly by that multilateral system, and other African or third world countries, or as we call them, the global south countries, are they treated fairly by this multilateral system? Or there is still hegemony embedded in that multilateral system? I will leave that question hanging, because these are just meant to be opening remarks. They're not meant to be the keynote address, which has to be interrogated by our special host here, Mr. Edward Cullen. But we believe that the global tensions that the world faces and the abandonment of consensus and compliance with the multilateral system, which was agreed on, which has got a number of resolutions, is what's disturbing world peace and international progress. Because as a multilateral, using a multilateral approach, the world could have easily confronted the global financial crisis in 2008, 7 and 8. The world can confront issues like global warming fairly. Because the expectation that countries that are contributing much less to global warming should abandon certain energies, whilst those who are contributing quite a lot, and who have contributed quite a lot to the ozone layer, to the depletion of the ozone layer, contribute very little. Again, it's the unfairness of the multilateral system. So, but we are saying it's a multilateral system and diplomacy, so I'll be diplomatic here and say the media has got a critical role to inform and educate the population and build that critical mass where the voice of the weaker countries will be heard eventually, because there is consensus among them, and consensus which you would have helped to build. Thank you.
Honorable Dr. Frederick Shava, Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Trade, ably represented by Ambassador R.T. Karanisi, my brother, Mr. Nick Mangawana, the Permanent Secretary to the Ministry of Information, Publicity and Broadcasting Services, UN colleagues present here, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen, it is always great to meet the media on this particular day, because, as we say in Africa, we are stronger together. Or as one of my old grannies said, if you want to go far, go with somebody. If you want to go far, just go alone. I think my brother has tried to explain to you what are the tenets of multilateralism. But allow me to begin my remarks by quoting the UN Secretary General's message on multilateralism and diplomacy for peace day that was delivered on the 24th of April this year, and I quote, "Today, multilateralism is under attack from all sides, from the climate crisis to the multiplicity of conflicts, including the ongoing war in Ukraine, the governance of weapons of mass destruction, health emergencies, and the global refugee protection. These crises pose a threat to the three pillars of the work of the United Nations, and that is peace, security, development, and human rights." As you are all aware, the COVID-19 pandemic is a very tragic reminder of how deeply connected we are. There is a clear and urgent need for concrete multilateral solutions based on common actions across borders for the good of all humanity, starting with the equitable distribution of vaccines as a global public good. We are living in a world today with all its multiple challenges that we need a more network multilateralism with stronger coordination between regional and international organizations, international financial institutions, and public-private alliances. We need an inclusive multilateralism that draws on civil society, business, local and regional authorities, and others, and shares power more broadly and fairly. And we also need strong multilateral action now to engage from the pandemic safety to address the climate crisis and to build stronger, safer communities and societies. End of quote. Friends, the International Day of Multilateralism and Diplomacy for Peace seeks to reaffirm the UN Charter and its principles of resolving disputes among countries through peaceful means. Peace is a fundamental requisite and condition sine qua non for sustainable development. Violent conflict is increasingly recognized as one of the big obstacles to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. Its dramatic resurgence over the last few years has caused immense human suffering and have had enormous global impact. The statistics are appalling. Approximately 2 billion people live in conflict-affected countries, and there were a record number of 56 UN member states based conflicts in 2020 alone. The International Day of Multilateralism and Diplomacy for Peace acknowledges and calls on the urgent need for peaceful resolutions to conflicts among nations. Friends, ladies and gentlemen, the United Nations strongly advocates for conflict prevention. This means doing everything to help countries avert the outbreak of crises that take a high toll on humanity, undermining institutions and capacities to achieve peace and development. Here in Zimbabwe, the UN supports one of the national priorities through the 2022 to 2026 Zimbabwe UN Sustainable Development Cooperation that states and supports all people in the country, especially the most vulnerable and marginalized, and supporting them to benefit from more accountable institutions and systems for rule of law, human rights, and access to justice. This, to us, is a building block for sustainable peace. The global architecture for peace and security, forged in the aftermath of World War II, which my brother have already alluded to, is grounded in the universal commitment to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. With conflicts becoming more fragmented these days, more complex and more transnational, these tools have been profoundly challenged by the emergence of non-state actors, on one hand, and also ideologies at odds with international humanitarian law and increased sponsorship of proxy warfare. Friends and colleagues, the human and economic cost of conflicts around the world requires all of those concerns to work more collaboratively through the tried and tested multilateral arrangement and diplomacy. In this regard, allow me to share some perspective on how this can be achieved. First, the UN Chapter and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and its 17 goals must be at the core of conflict resolution and building peace. Development actors need to provide more support to national and regional entities, and also the Permanent Secretary alluded to, African Union, SADC, EU, etc., to support the prevention agendas through what we are calling a targeted, integrated, flexible, and sustained engagement. We strongly believe that this prevention agenda, in turn, should be integrated into development policies and efforts because, as it goes literally, or as is said literally, prevention is cost-effective, saves lives, and safeguards development gains. Second, countries working to address inequalities and exclusion, making national and local institutions more inclusive, and ensuring that development strategies are risk-informed are central to preventing the fraying of the social fabric that erupt into crisis. Third, acknowledging that the primary responsibility for preventive action rests with states, both through their national policy and their governance of the multilateral system. However, what are we seeing today? We are seeing a shifting global landscape. States are often one actor among many, but we strongly believe that states must work together with other actors to keep their countries on a pathway to peace. We need to invest in peace by providing funding to existing structures to ensure real-time early warning and response structures and promote dialogue at all times. Third, fostering the participation of young people as well as the organizations, movements, and networks that represent them is critical. There is a need for an intergenerational dialogue to institutionalize a paradigm shift from confrontational protest to constructive engagement. In this regard, the voice of the youth must be heard, and their aspirations, needs, and goals must be met. In addition, women's meaningful participation in all aspects of peace and security is critical to effective impact of our engagements. And that includes peace process, where it has been shown to have a direct impact on the sustainability agreement reached. Fifth, advances in information and communication technology represent opportunities for innovation, growth, and unfettered exchange of ideas. However, alongside opportunities are risks. ICT benefits and assets must be available to all and narrow the digital divide between high and low-income countries. Sixth, climate change presents new challenges, especially to poor and vulnerable countries and communities. While climate change alone does not cause violent conflict, it does create major stress, especially in fragile situations where governments have limited means to help their population adapt. The risk associated with climate change must be addressed swiftly in line with the multilateral instruments. Friends, all said and done, I cannot overemphasize that conflict prevention is about creating incentives for actors to choose diplomacy to resolve conflict without violence. But what has history taught us? Despite many changes in the post-Cold War multilateral architecture for conflict prevention and peace building, there have been clear achievements on the one side, both at a systemic level. Comprehensive multilateral legal frameworks are in place, and we are familiar with some of them. And also the tools and conduct of war is all clear to us. But we have an overarching responsibility of protecting human rights, addressing global threats, including climate change, the COVID-19 pandemic, issues of terrorism, and transnational criminal networks, and also promote what we are calling an inclusive approach to development. Operationally, the United Nations and regional organizations such as SADC and the African Union and European Union have provided global and regional forums to coordinate international responses to threats, peace, and stability based on the principles of subsidiarity and complementarity. The result has been important tools, including preventive diplomacy, which my brother talked about already, peace building, peacekeeping, addressing collectively global health threats such as COVID-19 and many other outbreaks that have proven instrumental in preventing conflicts, mediating ceasefires, peace agreements, and supporting global health responses and recovery process. While diplomacy is pursued at regional and global levels, we need to step up efforts to strengthen national mechanisms and policies to prevent conflicts and sustain peace. Young people are the present and the future of Africa in general, Zimbabwe inclusive. There is need to harness the demographic dividend and make the youth a catalyst and asset in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. We need to strengthen youth social mobility, opportunities to stem irregular migration flow, involvement in criminality, banditry, drug abuse, and violent extremism. Borders are not to be withdrawn at the whim of great powers. Territorial integrity and sovereignty are sacrosanct for states and just for everybody at large. The United Nations Charter is based on the sovereign equality of all its members. It calls for respect for the principles of equal rights and self-determination of people. Going forward, to transform this moment of crisis into a moment for multilateralism, there is an urgent need to renew commitment to dialogue and global solutions as the only sustainable path to peace. Friends, colleagues, the future hinges on international cooperation for the common good. And that global security depends on the norms set in the UN Charter and the body of the international law. A world in crisis needs action, cooperation, and trust. It needs every country to do its part, including Zimbabwe. We have resolved to call on the global community to invest in what we are calling network and inclusive multilateralism. And that's the path to peace and development. The history of Zimbabwe has already been told by the Permanent Secretary. And my position is very clear. Zimbabwe needs to reproduce itself. And it can only do that if the sanction regimes are lifted. It is so critical to remove the scourge around the people of Zimbabwe, because all what I have learned since I arrived here is the severe impact of the sanction on the ordinary Zimbabweans. If Zimbabwe is allowed to reproduce itself, it can underwrite all the debts we are talking about. It can repay its arrears. But without the opportunity to reproduce itself, it's going to be extremely difficult. I also call on the government of Zimbabwe to create a fair playing ground, encourage civic participation, address issues of human rights concerns, in order to create a platform to find a solution to this long, long problem of sanctions in this country. I'm still new in the country. I'm learning. I'm on a steep learning curve, but I've started appreciating some of these challenges. When I presented my credentials to the president of this beautiful country, I requested for one thing, that is the need to create an apex coordination platform that could be a place for policy and dialogue at the highest level. People must talk to move on. If we don't talk, we're not going to move on. We can ask difficult questions, but I also believe there are low-hanging fruits on which confidence can be built. But the self-determination of the Zimbabwe people is their right. And on this day of multilateralism, I really call on the international community to review the current sanction regimes, explore possibilities of debt relief, and give the people of Zimbabwe a chance to live in a just world. Thank you very much.
Excellency, Edward Cannon, UN Resident and Humanitarian Coordinator. My dear brother, Mr. Dick Mangwana, Secretary Minister of Information, Publicity and Broadcasting Services. Your Excellencies, members of the Diplomatic Corps, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, and most important of all, our dear brothers and sisters from the media. Let me, first of all, on behalf of my Honorable Minister, apologize for his absence. He would have wished to be here with us on this important day, but due to other pressing state engagement, he is unable to join us, and therefore he has delegated me to represent him. If my minister were here, this is what he was going to say. The International Day of Multilateralism and Diplomacy for Peace was established on 12 December 2018 through Resolution A/RES/73/127. It is an effort by the United Nations to preserve the charter that binds all states together towards a singular purpose of sustainable development, cooperation, and peaceful coexistence. On this important day, when the international community collectively reflects on the state of multilateralism and international cooperation in general, it is regrettable to note that negotiations and general discourse within the United Nations and in other multilateral fora have increasingly demonstrated a concerted assault on previously agreed principles governing international relations. As a former ambassador myself and now Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Trade, I have witnessed worrisome trend where colleagues representing developed countries are increasingly retreating from agreed positions and settled principles, such as the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, financing for development, the agreed official development assistance of 0.7% of GDP, preferential treatment of developing countries in general, and special and differential treatment of developing countries, among other principles. What is most disconcerting is that while developed countries are essentially backtracking from these agreed positions and time-honored principles and weakening the foundations of international cooperation, they campaign to place such burdensome commitments on us, the developing countries, in areas of climate action, trade liberalization, investment protection, among others. In the meantime, developed countries have been relentless with initiatives seeking unfettered access to our resources, while they themselves pursue protectionist policies in areas of trade, agriculture, technology transfer, and intellectual property. Zimbabwe will continue to register its concern for unilateral and plurilateral initiative and emphasize the primacy of multilateral character of the United Nations. For the last 7 decades since the end of the Cold War, the world has witnessed a plethora of challenges ranging from climate change, geopolitical tensions, terrorism, humanitarian and migratory crisis, all with cross-cutting effects. These challenges have had a profound effect on the practice of diplomacy. Redress of these challenges require multilateral diplomacy. Let me underscore the importance of solidarity and cooperation in the world we live in today, especially on urgent international issues. We should strive as a people to convince and encourage each other for the common good. Our deep understanding is that everyone has a responsibility to shape the world that we live in. Zimbabwe is committed to multilateralism and has strived since independence in 1990 to employ instruments of diplomacy and cooperation as provided for in the UN Charter to achieve these goals. We are a strong believer that benefits are derived from acting collectively rather than individually in the agency of global problems. Our experience with COVID-19 is highlighted by the UN Resident and Humanitarian Coordinator. Our experience with the COVID-19 pandemic has shown that vaccine nationalism, where national governments tend to follow their own interests instead of pursuing a more globally coordinated approach, has dealt a fatal blow to multilateralism. Instead of uniting us as one in the face of humanity off the surface of the earth, countries jostled for prestige, pushed self-agendas, while some strived to get first access to supplies of vaccines for purposes of hoarding and using this for geopolitical advantage. We have to understand that this nationalistic behavior has negative consequences on how effective the global pandemic can be managed and contained. While a lot of leaders have reaffirmed their commitment to multilateralism and international peace and security at the international forum, challenges such as climate change and the need to meet our commitments under 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development will require more commitment than platitude and general statements of solidarity. The world today faces this dire situation, which have seen countries in the Southern Hemisphere being the most affected. Solutions to climate change and to many other challenges require a holistic, multilateral approach. It requires selflessness, togetherness, understanding, and pragmatic solutions. Zimbabwe notes with appreciation the increase in the number of countries that have denounced unilateral coercive measures imposed by some powerful Western countries against weaker developing countries. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, sanctions are a form of economic warfare designed to cause suffering and disharmony. Sanctions signify the failure of diplomacy and peaceful resolution of disputes. It is difficult for multilateralism to strive where there is punishment. The world could be a better place if UN member states, which respect the Charter of the United Nations, solve their disputes in more pacific ways than recourse to war and coercion. The United Nations is the embodiment of multilateralism, as its existence ensures equality and cooperation among member states. Its continued existence is in the interest of all mankind. A number of challenges, however, continue to threaten this existence. Just to name a few: unilateralism by the more powerful countries, dysfunctional structures that have served their purpose and therefore need to be reformed, self-serving agendas set by the more powerful, and general disdain for the poor and less privileged countries. Zimbabwe reiterates its position that multilateralism will survive only if the United Nations security is reformed to accommodate regional balance and equitable representation. We in Zimbabwe would like to see the continued strengthening of the United Nations in general, and we are very grateful with the new system of resident coordinators because it does help in that respect. We support the reform of the Security Council so that it is more representative of the global outlook and present-day realities. Reform of the Security Council would thus strengthen forces of multilateralism and promote peaceful coexistence. Finally, multilateralism is under serious assault from other angles besides political. Less than multilateral approaches are increasingly manifesting through different guises and permutations, namely like-minded countries, coalitions of the willing, plurilaterals, joint statement initiatives, among other formations. Within the World Trade Organization, for example, groups of countries have coalesced to start negotiations on issues like digital trade, among other issues. What is disturbing is that such negotiations are taking place outside existing ministerial mandates and outside multilateral trade negotiating framework of the WTO agreement. What is further disturbing is that the rules that will emerge from these plurilateral negotiations will eventually be binding to all member states. These rules are negotiated under these circumstances and have negative effect of constraining the development policy space in developing countries like ours. What is clear is that opting out of multilateral trade negotiations as mandated by ministerial conferences should be seen as a direct negation of multilateralism, which should underpin international cooperation. In conclusion, this day should remind us of the imperative need to focus and sustain multilateralism, particularly now that the world continues to face a multiplicity of challenges. This responsibility lies on our generation, the youth, the media in all its diversity. This is the only way to secure a future, the future of generation to come. I thank you.